Hello, and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. In this video, I'll be discussing the fourth Doc Savage novel, The Polar Treasure, released in June 1933 in Doc Savage magazine, again by series primary writer Lester Dent, writing under the nom de plume Kenneth Robeson that was used for all the Doc Savage novels. This is still early on in the series, so there is some of the rougher, almost more bloodthirsty elements that were in the first three books still here, but at least there's more of the Doc Savage style and characterization already emerging at this point, as the more bloodthirsty elements were something that the editors at Street and Smith in particular were very adamant about trying to dial out, because they wanted Doc to be a hero for all ages and have more of that appeal. This book in particular is a classic for several reasons, but most notably because it's the one where Doc fights a polar bear. Let's just get that out of the way right now. If man fighting polar bear doesn't grab your attention, then this book isn't for you. However, if man fighting polar bear does grab your attention, you certainly get your money's worth with this Doc Savage novel. That's why it's the most iconic moment from this book. It's what everybody remembers. It's what Bantam used right front and center on their cover art for the paperback reissue. And it begs the question why this wasn't used for the original Pulp cover. But the original Pulp cover is really wonderful in the early style of the Doc Savage covers. But this is a pure adventure with all the wonderful pulp fun and aspects that you expect from a pulp magazine classic. The plot gets off to a running start with Doc Savage saving the blind famed violinist Victor Vale from an attack following an outstanding concert he just performed, which of course is of an amazing piece of music that was written by the Man of Bronze, that also proves his mastery of music composition, as well as literally every field of human endeavor. But for whatever reason, it seems not one but two gangs are after Vale and want to kidnap him or abduct him for some reason, and these are all individuals seemingly of a seafaring nature, so essentially sailors who use a lot of nautical terms, so it's basically like two gangs of pirates who are after this character, who is then put under the protection of Doc Savage and the Fabulous Five, and after a series of escapades in and around New York and Doc's headquarters in the 86th floor of the tallest building, of course the Empire State Building, it emerges that perhaps Vale's history of being one of the passengers, one of the few who survived from the notorious shipwreck, the Oceanic, which sank in the Arctic many years before, and only certain individuals made it out, with there also having been potentially a great treasure of $50 million or more in gold and jewels that was aboard the ship. Now, this is an unknown factor, but $50 million in 1933 is quite an inducement for anyone. And on top of that, there is a map to the shipwreck, but this isn't any sort of normal map. No, this is a map that was actually tattooed on the blind man's back, but is not tattooed in normal ink. No, this is a tattoo that can only be read under ultraviolet light. So it takes an X-ray to actually see it. That conceit in and of itself is enough to delight anyone reading this story, and is a sign of the type of ingenuity you have to expect from a classic Doc Savage adventure. Our heroes, along with Vale, eventually find themselves on an Arctic expedition of sorts aboard the futuristic submarine Helldiver, which Doc Savage also takes it upon himself to redesign to his own specifications to become the ultimate Arctic exploration vehicle. So right there, you've got something that was very far out there and fascinating for 1930s audiences, of a deep Arctic expedition that is drawing directly on real-world parallels, and something that was still relatively unexplored at the time. The story then becomes, can they actually make it to this shipwreck? Are there saboteurs or members of the two gangs on board? Where will the two gangs actually appear? And on top of that, were there any further survivors of the oceanic shipwreck who may still be lost up there in the Arctic all these years later? And among those potential survivors, could Vale's wife and daughter, who were lost among those presumed dead, still potentially be alive? So there are multiple plot threads that are running. And then the rest of the book is our characters having adventures in and on the actual Arctic surface, and of course getting out of the submarine, actually making it to the shipwreck, and trying to determine if the treasure was ever real in the first place, and if it was, does it actually still exist somewhere, while fighting off not one but two two gangs of pirates and the vicious natives of the area. And so the action then begins to pile on. But interestingly, this whole final act in the Arctic does feel a bit stretched out. There's actually quite a bit of wandering around and our characters getting split up, and the classic conceit of some characters being presumed dead, but not actually being dead. And this even happens to Doc Savage himself at one point in the book, although he has a rather wonderful way of getting out of it, of course. So you do have to expect all the classical conceits of a pulp adventure, but I would say, ironically, that for me, the first half of the book was actually the stronger, more interesting one, because once you get to the Arctic, it does feel like it is stretched out a little bit in terms of pacing. And there are one or two elements that do stretch credibility, and I'm not even talking about Doc fighting a polar bear. And that, of course, happens here. You may have some issues with the second half if you're like me, but you get to the moment where Doc Savage has to fight a polar bear with his bare hands, and that in and of itself is worth everything. So any slight criticisms I have go out the window, because Doc Savage has to fight a polar bear with his bare hands in order to survive, and then actually manages to win a fight against a polar bear because he's Doc Savage. The Man in Bronze can do anything. It's no surprise that Doc Savage manages to beat a polar bear with his bare hands, but it's also done in a matter of it's kill or be killed, and Doc still has to struggle for it. He may be a Superman in everything but name, but he is still a mortal man. So even when you have the incredible feats, there is still an element of believability, because Doc fighting a polar bear is much like Edgar Rice Burroughs' famous Tarzan fighting a gorilla or a crocodile or a lion with his bare hands. It's that sort of extreme Superman who is still mortal and is almost killed, technically still. But it's such a striking moment that it towers above everything else in the book. And this book still piles on the action in the final act. So one element in the final act of the book where you do unfortunately have some dated aspects is in how it uses the natives of the Arctic. So here you have appearances by the Inuit people. They're also referred to as Eskimos in this book, and they are essentially the unwitting dupes of the two pirate gangs, and they're shown to be essentially tricked and coerced into attacking Doc and his aides, and there's a substantial body count actually that happens. So there's a lot of killing and death in the final act, which almost harkens back to the bloodthirstiness of Book 2, The Land of Terror. It's not quite at that bloodthirsty level, but there's certainly a bit of it. And so that was kind of unexpected, because the rest of the book is very much getting to the classical Doc Savage. So you can get the sense that this is still book 4 in a series, and it's finding its way, and it's working itself towards the sort of classical Doc Savage storytelling style, but it's not quite there yet. There's still some last vestiges of the early rougher edges. The Inuit characters are all secondary and side characters. I mean, when you read this story, it's very much like reading any sort of older or classic Western story and having Native American characters be very one note and be sort of tricked or coerced into attacking the heroes by the villainous forces. That's the sort of a dynamic here. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it's also very much a product of its time, and it's surprising how many get killed, because it's almost like a swarm of armies of natives are attacking in the Arctic and on the shipwreck. And then there's also some quite grisly elements, because when they actually get into the ship, they find the remains of the dead survivors, and now they'd been strung up and everything. And it's quite graphic and extraordinarily striking in a way that you don't quite expect from a pulp novel of this era. So this book does manage to have really striking moments that burn themselves into your brain, whether it's the futuristic Arctic submarine, or the blind violinist being attacked who has a ultraviolet tattoo of a treasure map of sorts on his back, and the potential of long lost survivors and a $50 million treasure in gold bullion lost in the Arctic, and people being marooned on the ice and having to survive, and Doc Savage having to use all of his skills to manage to have not just himself but his entire team survive and get to the bottom of all this while fighting off not one but two gangs of pirates, and ultimately, above everything, Doc Savage fighting a polar bear with his bare hands. There's something for everyone in this story, and it moves at a rather good pace overall. You can tell that this is building off of the elements that worked in the previous three books. It is viewed as a classic among Doc Savage fans. I think some of that does obviously have to do with it having the iconic polar bear fight. And it does, I think, for most of the book, move pretty well. For me, it did kind of bog down, though, in that final act, and some of that may have to do with the Sanctum edition actually restoring it. What it says is over 1,000 words of the original manuscript. It said that these were some of the more bloodthirsty elements I just highlighted, and this was something that the editors at Street and Smith were trying to stamp out in this series, because they wanted this series to do something different and not go into those elements. So as far as I'm aware, the Sanctum version is the only complete printing of the original story. So the original issue and all the reissues and reprints and the Bantam paperback is slightly edited. So when people said this had some bloodthirsty elements before, well, it was actually a little bit more bloodthirsty in the original text that's only in the Sanctum version. For me personally, though, I have to say, as much as I enjoyed reading this and that I could clearly tell it was building off of what worked in the previous three books, I have to say I actually preferred Quest of the Spider more, even though that had some more storytelling issues and quirks and had some wilder aspects and certainly had even more dated aspects to it. I kind of liked how that one was a bit more consistent throughout and had even more wilder elements sprinkled in. Here in Polar Treasure, I think you can recognize its stronger at its core, but it's that final act kind of being a bit stretched out and having some elements that felt a little much, that made it feel a little bit less enjoyable than Quest of the Spider was. But this is still a Doc Savage classic that I would recommend to anyone. It's an absolute blast of fun and pure pulp energy. Now, let's talk a little bit about the artwork for the Polar Treasure. There's two primary covers. The original 1933 Pulp magazine cover is a beautifully realized vision of Doc in parka and with beautiful likeness, bold color. We've got the Helldiver submarine surfaced in the background, all the wonderful ice flows, and this bold red-orange sky in the background. The color and detail is just attention-grabbing and immediate. But this actually is at least giving us the polar bear fight. But here it's going for a much more subtle approach because we have Doc prepared for something. And obviously it's a tense moment, but then you start to see that obviously it's the shadow of the polar bear with open jaws reflected on the big block of ice behind Doc. So this is giving us the polar bear fight, but indirectly. So when you first see this, I don't know if you immediately noticed the shadow, because I certainly didn't. I just thought it was Doc in an action pose. It took me a minute to realize that the darker coloring, the shadow on Doc's parka hood, actually leads into the shadow of the polar bear he's confronting. So this is going for more of a suspense feel to the most famous moment from the book, and it works. It's just not immediately obvious because it takes you a second to recognize the shadow of the polar bear in the back. But the detail, the composition, the color, everything here is first rate, and it's one of the great classic Doc covers. In the 1960s, when Bantam did their famous paperback reissues of the Doc Savage novels, they created the iconic artwork and style that was mostly done by the legendary artist James Bama, that literally drew Doc Savage as the Man of Bronze, with these amazingly epic covers and new font for the actual logo and the titles. but some of these other covers were done by a variety of artists, and not all of them are known. So on the Polar Treasure, it's still debated on who the artist was. But here, as you can clearly tell, they put the big moment on the front cover that lets you know this is what you put your money down on, because here we have the polar bear fight in full graphic detail with the wind and the snow howling, and what it looks like they're standing on an icy precipice. And here the enormous man of bronze is completely engulfed by what seems like a gigantic polar bear lunging at him. So essentially, if you see this cover and you don't immediately want to pick up this book and read it, then let's just say Pulp Fiction is probably not for you, because this just stokes the fires of adventure in everyone who sees it. It's a fantastic cover. It's extremely stylized, over the top, exactly as this moment is in the book, and just a classic Bantam cover. But I do have to admit that I still prefer the style and iconic design of the original Pulp magazine covers of the 30s. So it's a bit of a toss-up. Each one is outstanding for the period in which it was made. But as much as I love having the actual polar bear fight on the front cover, I think this is slightly eclipsed just in my own personal preference by the original magazine cover. Now, I read this in the Sanctum Books Volume 6 of Doc Savage Stories, which is another of theirs that actually has consecutive stories. Sanctum didn't print the Doc Savage or Shadow novels in order. They typically did theme pairings, but sometimes, like this volume here, you get consecutive books. So this actually has books 4 and 5, and that's even more important because Book 4 does essentially lead into Book 5. You can still read them separately, but essentially the ending of Book 4 puts our characters at the point where they start Book 5. So this being an earlier volume, this was when they were still going under the Nostalgia Ventures name. But this is also one of the ones that is still relatively available. You can find used copies, as the earlier volumes they printed more copies of, and these had more print runs. So the earlier the volume, the easier it is to get. So the rear always has a lovely reproduction of both of the magazine covers in terms of the books that are contained, with a little blurb about each. And there's also a blurb with a Stan Lee quote talking about how influential Doc Savage and the Fabulous Five were, particularly on the Fantastic Four. And that's a very fitting quote, because basically the Fantastic Four in terms of concept come directly from the Fabulous Five, just like Doc Savage starts this novel being away at his Fortress of Solitude. If you look closely enough, there's very little in comics that doesn't have a connection to something that it took from the Pulp magazine characters. Inside, we have the same amazing Sanctum quality and layout. Again, as I always say in these, the Sanctum volumes really are the gold standard for Pulp reprints. So we have the entirety of the text of both novels, plus some wonderful supplements. We get a full reproduction of the text in the original dual column style with new typeset, so it's easy to read, and you get the original Pulp magazine experience, plus restoration of all the original internal illustrations. Here again is the early artist rendering of Doc Savage, where he is clearly modeled on Clark Gable. Then we get some nice images of the Fabulous 5A. So here's an image of Rennie and of the famous monk. Here's Long Tom and Johnny. Here's a nice image of Doc and some of his friends being shot at in the ice. Here's our image of the iconic Ham Brooks. And of course, you know it had to be here. An illustration of the polar bear fight exactly as it happens in the text with full detail. I mean, this is just Pulp Fiction defined right here. And then at the end, there's some text about the restorations that went into this in terms of restoring the cover art of Book 5, but also restoring the 1,000 or so words that I mentioned earlier from the original manuscript. So this is one of the important Sanctum volumes that restores the original uncut text of one of these classic Pulp tales. And another reason why the Sanctum volumes are so important to have, because this book has never been before or since published in its original uncut version. Then we get another of Will Murray's classic intermission essays, giving you more detail about each of the novels in this volume and why they were paired together. Now, it should also be said that The Polar Treasure and the Sanctum reprint only run 65 pages, so already the pacing is increasing, the page count's a little bit shorter, and the story moves overall with a good pace. So again, you get that sense that the ball is now rolling with the series. Some of the kinks have been worked out already. More are being worked out as we go along, and things are improving. The Polar Treasure really is a classic Doc Savage story. It's a classic pulp adventure. It's worth reading if you love adventure stories. It's worth reading if you want to get more into pulp fiction, and I would recommend this to anyone. It would make for a good first Doc Savage story if you've never read one before. And thankfully, the all-important Sanctum volume is still relatively available on the used market. Again, the earlier the volume, the easier it is to get typically. It's usually the first 10 to maybe 15 volumes or so in the Doc Savage and Shadow Sanctum reprints that are the most available. When you find them on eBay or in comic stores, they're typically still somewhere around the $15 list price, sometimes $20 to $30 or more. But the problem is that ever since Sanctum lost the rights to the major characters from Condé Nast and all the volumes went out of print, that you're at the mercy of whatever seller wants to charge. And volumes like this are so important because they are the only source of the original uncut text, and all the Sanctum editions, in addition to restoring crucial material like this for the first and only time, did such an excellent job on the printing and the reproduction of the artwork and the supplemental essays that each volume gives you a greater sense into the world that generated these amazing stories and helped to write a great deal of modern pop culture. So definitely get the Sanctum volume, and you get the added benefit of it being one of the ones that has consecutive books in it. So you can read The Polar Treasure and then immediately jump into the next book. As always, I hope my babblings about the classic world of Doc Savage and the magic of pulp fiction have been at least somewhat fun and informative. I will leave relevant links in the description below, where hopefully you can find a copy of this incredible Sanctum Volume 6 yourself. And I'd also love to hear from any Doc Savage fans who know the slightly trimmed version of the book versus this Sanctum version, and if that extra 1,000 words or so made any major difference in describing more of the more grisly action beats and such. In any case, please do keep supporting the incredible work of the pulp reprint publishers and pulp historians who are keeping our pulpular history alive. Keep supporting your local independent bookstores and comic shops who need all the help they can get. Keep reading the magical world of pulp fiction, and thank you ever so much for watching.